A racist teacher, a student he thought he could silence. But there's a twist that no one expected. What unfolds next will tear the mask off hidden biases and shake this classroom to its core. Get ready for a story that reveals the truth about what happens when prejudice is confronted head-on. It was a typical day at Jefferson High School, or at least it seemed so on the surface. But if you looked a little closer, you'd notice the tension lingering in Mr. Bill Henderson's history class. A seasoned teacher, sure, but known for his biased views that he rarely bothered to hide. Today, though, things shifted with the arrival of Maya Johnson, a bright young girl stepping into a mid-semester whirlwind. Imagine the nerves she must have felt. A new student entering a space where the air was already thick with an unspoken discomfort. Yet here she was, walking straight into Mr. Henderson's class, a figure of calm amidst brewing conflict. Now, Maya wasn't the type to shrink back, even if the odds were stacked against her. She sat down, glanced around, and immediately sensed it. The way Mr. Henderson's eyes narrowed, how the room seemed to adjust its focus the moment she crossed the threshold. You know that feeling when someone's sizing you up, trying to figure out if you fit into their pre-drawn boxes? That's exactly what happened. "Welcome," Mr. Henderson said with a forced smile. But beneath the surface, the real game had already begun. Maya knew it, and so did he. Maya's arrival didn't just mark the introduction of a new student, it set the stage for a silent battle. Jefferson High wasn't unfamiliar with racial tensions, but this felt different. It's strange how one person's presence can change the energy of an entire room, right? Mr. Henderson, sensing a challenge, began tightening his grip on the classroom's tone. Maya, however, didn't need to say much. Her mere existence seemed to rattle him. You could feel it. Something was about to give. And as the tension built, the rest of the class waited, watching, wondering what would come next. The moment Maya sat down in Mr. Henderson's class, it was like she had walked into a lion's den. But Maya, being the bold, intelligent young woman she was, didn't shy away. When the lesson turned to topics like slavery and the civil rights movement, it didn't take long for Maya to offer her perspective. Yet, every time she spoke, Mr. Henderson cut her off. "That's not exactly relevant right now," he'd say, with that patronizing tone we all know too well. He didn't want to hear her thoughts, but Maya's insights were sharp, and that probably rattled him more than he cared to admit. As the days went on, Maya's contributions didn't just stop at history. She shared personal stories, talked about her family's experiences, and connected them with what was being taught. And what did Mr. Henderson do? He dismissed her again and again. His comments, though subtle, dripped with condescension. "Maybe you're a little too sensitive on this subject, Maya," he'd say, as if her lived experiences were somehow less valid than the textbook version. The other students noticed too, but they stayed quiet, unsure of how to react, trapped between the authority of their teacher and the truth they saw in Maya's words. By the way, if this story is already making you think about standing up for what's right, make sure to subscribe to the channel. You don't want to miss out any great stories like this. So, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Back to the story. It's hard not to feel the weight of such moments. Maya wasn't just facing a teacher. She was up against a system of thought, one that had been deeply embedded into the fabric of that classroom long before she arrived. Still, she didn't let it break her. Instead, she remained composed, her eyes steady as she waited for her next chance to speak. Because even though Mr. Henderson tried to silence her, she knew her voice mattered. And every time he shut her down, it only fueled her resolve. You could sense that something bigger was brewing, and Maya wasn't backing down anytime soon. Over the next few weeks, the pattern became more obvious. Every time Maya raised her hand, eager to contribute, Mr. Henderson would simply look past her. It was as if she didn't exist in his version of the classroom. And when he did acknowledge her, it was only to brush aside her comments as irrelevant or off-topic. We've all been there, haven't we? Watching someone try to share their truth, only to be silenced, time and time again. It wasn't just about her words, it was about erasing her presence, her perspective. And the more he ignored her, the more the other students followed suit. "Why does he keep doing that?" one student whispered to another after class. But no one dared to stand up in the moment. It's easier to stay silent, to blend in, especially when the person marginalizing someone holds the power in the room. This silent complicity began to take root. A few students, emboldened by Mr. Henderson's actions, started rolling their eyes when Maya spoke, or making snide remarks under their breath. Maya, though, wasn't blind to it. She saw everything, but she chose to rise above, knowing that her silence would speak volumes more than their whispers ever could. If you've ever been in a situation like this, where standing out feels more like a burden than a privilege, you know how isolating it can be. But Maya, she wasn't about to let the subtle, and not so subtle, attempts to shut her down define her. Sometimes the quiet strength of perseverance is louder than words. As the days passed, it became clear that her resilience was something far beyond Mr. Henderson's reach. And yet, the atmosphere in the class grew heavier, inching towards a breaking point. As weeks passed, the hostility in the classroom became undeniable. Mr. Henderson's dismissive attitude toward Maya was no longer subtle. It was out in the open for all to see. Every time Maya spoke, he would cut her off, sometimes with a sneer or an obvious eye roll. "Let's stick to the facts, shall we?" he would say, as if Maya's perspectives had no place in a history class. And like a domino effect, some of the students followed suit. It didn't take long for a few of them to join in, throwing side comments or openly laughing when Maya attempted to speak up. The classroom that once buzzed with diverse ideas was now a space where Maya's voice was drowned out. One day, while discussing the civil rights movement, Maya raised her hand yet again. This time, Mr. Henderson didn't even bother acknowledging her. Instead, he turned to another student, inviting them to share their thoughts. Maya kept her hand raised, though, refusing to back down. "Still not getting the hint, huh?" whispered a classmate beside her, a smirk on their face. It was clear. This wasn't just about Maya anymore. It was about setting an example of who had power in that room, and it wasn't going to be her, or at least that's what Mr. Henderson hoped. Hostility has a way of breeding silence, and in that room, silence spoke louder than words. While Maya continued to stand her ground, others began to fade into the background, too afraid to be next in line for Mr. Henderson's ridicule. You see, in every confrontation like this, people tend to pick sides, even if they don't realize it. And many in that class had unconsciously aligned themselves with Mr. Henderson, not because they agreed with him, but because it was safer. But Maya? She wasn't swayed. There was something in her that couldn't be silenced, and as the hostility reached its peak, it felt like something had to give. Despite the escalating hostility, Maya refused to let it break her spirit. Every time Mr. Henderson dismissed her, she simply raised her hand again, her quiet resilience growing more evident with each passing day. It's incredible how someone can maintain such calm under pressure, right? While the other students either watched in silence or participated in the subtle mocking, Maya remained composed. She knew her voice mattered, and even if no one was listening now, there was power in standing firm. There's a lesson in that, isn't there? Sometimes strength doesn't need to be loud. It's found in persistence. One afternoon, during a particularly charged lesson on civil rights, Maya raised her hand again. The tension in the room was thick, as usual, but this time, a few students hesitated before jumping to ridicule her. They were starting to see it too, the injustice, the blatant attempts to silence her. Slowly, Maya's perseverance was planting seeds of doubt in the minds of those who had blindly followed Mr. Henderson's lead. "Why doesn't she just stop?" one student whispered, but another replied, "Because she knows she's right." And that right there, that quiet acknowledgement from her peers, was the beginning of a shift. Maya's unwavering stance in the face of exclusion started to inspire those around her. A few students, who had once joined in the ridicule, began to recognize the strength in her silence and calm. They were still too afraid to speak up, but the cracks in Mr. Henderson's authority were starting to show. Maya's resilience wasn't just about surviving, it was about subtly changing the room, one small act of defiance at a time. And in the process, she was becoming more than just a student. She was becoming a symbol of quiet courage, and her presence was impossible to ignore. What Mr. Henderson didn't know was that Maya wasn't fighting this battle alone. At home, she shared every detail of what was happening in class with her mother, Angela Johnson. And Angela, as it turns out, was no ordinary parent. She was a well-known civil rights activist, someone who had spent years advocating for racial equity in education. When Maya told her about the growing hostility in Mr. Henderson's class, Angela didn't waste any time. She contacted the school's superintendent, and plans were quickly set in motion. But here's the twist. They decided to observe Mr. Henderson without his knowledge, a decision that would soon turn the tide. One morning, as the students settled in for another tense history lesson, Maya noticed something different. In the back of the classroom, unnoticed by most, sat the superintendent, Mrs. Linda Patterson, and a couple of other school administrators. They had slipped in quietly, there to witness firsthand what Maya had described to her mother. The class proceeded as usual, Mr. Henderson, once again, brushing off Maya's raised hand with an air of indifference. He had no idea he was being watched, and the moment was approaching when the curtain would be pulled back on his actions. The class was about to dive into yet another discussion on civil rights, when Mr. Henderson, for what seemed like the 100th time, interrupted Maya mid-sentence. His voice dripped with impatience. "We've already covered that, Maya. Let's move on," he said dismissively. But this time, something was different. Just as he turned to continue the lesson, Mrs. Patterson stood up. The quiet visitor at the back of the room was no longer invisible. "Actually, Mr. Henderson," she interrupted, her voice steady, "I think we need to address something before we move on." The room went silent, and all eyes turned to the back. Something big was about to happen, and everyone knew it. As the students turned their attention to Mrs. Patterson, the tension in the room skyrocketed. Mr. Henderson, visibly caught off guard, tried to mask his discomfort. "Is there something wrong?" he asked, attempting to maintain control. But everyone in that room could feel the shift. This wasn't just any interruption. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her eyes calm but determined. "We've been observing your class, Mr. Henderson," she said, with a firmness that left no room for doubt. The students exchanged glances, some leaning forward in their seats, sensing that the moment they'd been waiting for had finally arrived. Mr. Henderson, clearly rattled, tried to brush off the comment. "I wasn't aware we had visitors," he said, forcing a smile. But Maya knew this was the moment the truth would come to light. "We're here because we've received reports of discriminatory behavior," Mrs. Patterson continued, her gaze not leaving his. "Specifically in how you've been treating Maya and her contributions during class discussions." The silence in the room was deafening. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others seemed almost relieved that someone was finally saying what they had been thinking all along. At that moment, Maya's heart raced, but she stayed composed, her eyes focused on the unfolding confrontation. Mr. Henderson tried to defend himself, stammering through half-hearted explanations. "I've always run this class fairly. I didn't mean to." But Mrs. Patterson wasn't having it. "Your actions speak louder than your intentions, Mr. Henderson," she said firmly. "We've seen enough to understand the pattern here." The weight of her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Mr. Henderson found himself on the other side of the silence, no longer in control. The room, once oppressive for Maya, was now filled with a different energy. A reckoning was at hand. Mrs. Patterson didn't waste any time in making the consequences of Mr. Henderson's actions clear. In front of the entire class, she laid out the evidence of his discriminatory behavior. The students watched, some in disbelief, as Mrs. Patterson cited instances where Maya's contributions were ignored, interrupted, or dismissed without reason. "This kind of behavior has no place in our school," she stated firmly. There was a sense of justice in her words, a weight that resonated deeply within the room. The message was clear. This was no longer a place where prejudice could hide under the guise of authority. Mr. Henderson, now visibly shaken, tried to regain control. "This has all been a misunderstanding," he muttered, though even he didn't seem convinced by his own words. But Mrs. Patterson wasn't swayed. "The evidence speaks for itself," she said, her voice unwavering. "You've repeatedly marginalized a student based on her race, and that is unacceptable." The room felt different now, lighter, as if the oppressive air that had hung over it for weeks was finally being lifted. The students, especially those who had quietly supported Maya, sat up straighter, their expressions reflecting a mixture of relief and newfound hope. Mr. Henderson was officially dismissed from his position, his reign of bias brought to an end. But the story didn't end there. In an unexpected turn of events, Angela Johnson, Maya's mother, was invited by the school to lead a series of talks on diversity and inclusion. It was a powerful statement, a sign that Jefferson High was ready to turn a new page. For Maya, this moment wasn't just a victory for herself. It was a victory for every student who had ever been silenced, marginalized, or made to feel like they didn't belong. And with her mother by her side, Maya knew that this was just the beginning of something bigger. In the weeks following Mr. Henderson's dismissal, Jefferson High began to transform. The school administration took swift action, implementing new programs focused on diversity and inclusion, ensuring that every student, no matter their background, would feel heard and valued. Maya, once the target of isolation, was now at the center of this change. Her quiet courage had sparked something far bigger than just a personal victory. She had become a symbol of resilience, showing everyone what it meant to stand up for what's right, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. Maya's influence didn't stop there. She was invited to lead a new student group dedicated to promoting dialogue and respect among her peers. Imagine that, a once hostile classroom, now filled with students eager to engage in open discussions about race, history, and justice. It was an environment of growth, not just for Maya, but for everyone involved. I never thought I'd see the day where people actually listened to me," Maya confided in one of her friends, a soft smile on her face. But the truth was, she had always been someone worth listening to. Now, others were finally catching up. Jefferson High had become more than just a school. It was now a place where real change was happening. Students were no longer afraid to voice their opinions, to challenge the status quo, or to stand in solidarity with those who had been silenced. And as for Maya, she had found her voice, not only for herself, but for the generations of students who would come after her. She had started something that couldn't be stopped, a movement of empathy, understanding, and strength. This was only the beginning of her journey, and the ripples of her actions would be felt for years to come. Moral of the story: stories like Maya's remind us that courage can come from the most unexpected places. When faced with injustice, how would you respond? Would you stay silent or speak up, even when it feels like no one's listening? Think about it. Maya's quiet resilience sparked a ripple effect that changed not just her classroom, but her entire school. So, what are the injustices around you that need a voice? Comment below and share your thoughts. And if this story moved you, make sure to click on the channel to dive deeper into more real-life stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on powerful stories like this one.